Thanks to the organizers for inviting me and also for the flexibility around the sudden pivot. And so part of the idea today is just like, let me tell you about a tool. You probably already know this tool. And if not, hopefully it's something that you can put in your toolkit. And sort of like, and hopefully there's also some different ways of thinking about this type of tool that might be useful to you. And sort of what I'm going to talk about today is about graph neural networks. So this is neural networks on graph structured data. And it's inspired on a blog post that we put on. It's an interactive blog post, so I encourage you to check it out in your free time. It's like you can click on things, you can move things. So like the idea is that you can take your time and sort of connect with it. It's on a GitHub repo, so you can put issues if you're like, oh, actually, I think this is wrong. There's a typo. Part of the idea of showing you this hammer is I have a few prompts, and what I encourage you to do during these prompts is talk to somebody, especially somebody that you probably don't know. Maybe it's a good way of just like connecting with somebody that you don't know. So just like I encourage you to talk to somebody. These are supposedly easy questions. They're not like a math question. So like you can talk about you can even talk about something else if you want. Just I encourage you to talk. So let's go over it. And sort of the main blocks that the panorama of what I'm going to talk to you about is sort of why graph neural networks might be a good tool when working with graphs. And to start, I want to sort of talk about graphs as a very general and flexible data structure. Then I want to tell you about some graph problems, not all graph problems, but how we can use graph neural networks to solve these types of graph problems. And then I want to get inside of a graph neural network, just show you a little bit what a graph neural network looks like. It's going to be a very sort of simple graph neural network, but it's already something that can be very powerful. And there's also miscellaneous graph topics, but I think that's where we're going to pivot with Wengong and just talk about graph neural networks, molecules, and just like open it up more for discussion. And there's also a sibling Distill post here that you can also look at. That's understanding graph neural networks. These are the two last posts that came from Distill before it closed down. Both of them are on graph neural networks, and they have different viewpoints of how to look at these tools. So let's start with graphs. So the first point is like graphs are all around us. Like I personally consider that any form of data can be cast as a graph. That doesn't mean it's the most efficient way of being a graph, but everything can be a graph. And so I want to convince you a little bit of this point. And some examples of where we can find graphs is social networks, how we relate to each other. You can build a graph out of that. You can build a graph out of maps. You can put locations and routes that connect them. You can also think about algorithms or code or neural networks. Often it's about the flow of information or how one variable affects the other. And with that, we can construct a graph. And also a very common and probably more relevant to the road is molecules and materials. So often when we think about molecules and materials, even though they're like much more complicated objects, we approximate them with graphs. And this allows us to sort of be able to tackle problems with them. And in general, a way of thinking about graphs is, before we get in there, is like, it's mostly about a collection of items and the relationships between them. So let's start with the first prompt. What are some graphs that you particularly are interested in? How sparse are they? So that means how connected or loosely connected are they? And what kind of information do you put in them? So, just find somebody, talk about what are graphs that you think you might be interested in. Yeah, so, okay, so we set out the prompt. There's a few people that wrote in the chat. So for example, Ashley said, gene regulatory networks. Somebody mentioned phosphorylation networks. And I think that might also be related to sort of like metabolic networks or anything that relates to like reaction networks. Somebody was just interested in small molecules. Here in the audience, does anybody just want to share like one type of network that they care about? Just like quickly, like just say it out loud.
Cell-cell interaction.
Complex saccharins. Ooh,
cell-cell interaction.
Cell-cell interactions, yeah. Another one. I heard knowledge graphs somewhere. Woo. And there's many different forms of knowledge graphs, right? It's like a very like structured form of data. So as you can see, there's a lot of graphs, and I hope, like, I encourage you to talk to other people that you're like, oh, actually, I care about those graphs too. I probably didn't cover all the graphs. So let's go over some ways of thinking about graphs. So let's first define the graph. A very useful way of thinking about a graph, and there's many types of graphs, but this is, I think, one of the probably the most comprehensive ones, is thinking about graphs in terms of three items. Nodes, which you can also think about vertices. So these are these circles. You can also think about edges or the connections between them. You can also hear the word links. And there's also something called a master node or a global node. So this is information about the entire system. So there's three levels of information, like information at the node level, at the edge level, and at the global system level. And here we can go over each of them. So here we got the edges. Here we have the global, the entire thing. So when we think about graphs, like, it's useful to try to identify which are the parts when we're thinking about, graphs. And we can load information into our graphs that is multi-dimensional. So for example, in an edge, we can load in a vector that has many information about the different types of connections. You're thinking about a molecule, that might be the type of bond. It could be the distance between bonds. If it's like a social network, it can be like, is it a friend or an enemy? Like how many friends do you have in common? So here you can load in information into the graph, right? So what you can think about is that each of these components has a single vector, or it could be an array that has information or attributes that you care about. And the other thing is that there's also directionality. Sometimes information can flow in both directions, which is like an undirected edge, but it can also be directed. So for example, if you think about plumbing, water is going to flow in a particular direction. So that's a directed edge. And so one thing that you might not think about is images as graphs. So how can we model an image as a graph? So here we have a very basic image. It's like 5 by 5 pixels, and they're binary pixels, like a smiley face. If you wanted to model this as a graph, one way you could do it is for every pixel, you look at all the neighboring pixels. You say this, because it's a neighboring pixel, they're going to share an edge. And so here we have the graph representation of this image. And you can see that the color indicates the information that is loaded onto this node. We have this other representation that tells us how things are connected. For every pixel, we make a node, and we look at which other pixel it's connected to. And so this is what is called an adjacency matrix. It tells us how things are connected. And something you can probably see is that there's a very regular sort of diagonal pattern on this adjacency matrix. And so this already tells you a little bit about why we don't use graphs to model images, because there's already a very regular structure. There's much more efficient ways of modeling images than just thinking about graphs. Another form of data that you might also model as a graph is text. So we can have a sentence, and one way that we could model the sentence is every word is a node. And we connect the nodes if it proceeds. And in this case, there's a directionality. And so here we have graphs are all around us, and you can see that there's also a regular pattern, this diagonal on the connectivity. So it doesn't really make sense to model it as a graph, unless you want to do like more crazy, weird things with text, which you might be doing if you're doing transformer. And so this is one way. This is one of the reasons why we don't model text as graphs. One thing that we might want to model as graphs are, for example, molecules. If we consider atoms as nodes and bonds as edges, we can get a connectivity pattern, and you can see that connectivity pattern is looks a little bit more random. It's not random, obviously, but just it's less predictable than the other ones we had. For example, we can also look at a social network. And so this is all the characters in the Othello play. And if they have an interaction with a character in the play, they have an edge. And so it's sort of the connectivity of who talks to each other during that play. Yes.
You assume a way of ordering them, but once you get to molecules, there's not really an obvious way to order on the adjacency graph.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and we're actually going to touch on it in a few slides later. Because it's like, how do you model? How do you take into account the ordering? A really good aspect is like, here we have Bianca, Brantillo, like it's ordered alphabetically, but you could also order it however you want, right? And it should still be a graph, and it should still be the same graph. So that's a very important property of graphs. And it's important to think about how do we incorporate this into our model. This is a karate club data graph. It's a really interesting graph because it's actually a social graph. And somebody in Australia in the 70s like picked up this data, and there was essentially like two instructors. Well, there was an instructor, Mr. He, and John H., which is the administrator of the karate gym. And it turns out that there was a fight between them. And then so there were some people that went into the Mr. He group, and there's people that went to the John H. group. And sort of what they studied is like, can we predict like which group or which camp are you more likely to join? And a lot of it had to do with who you connected and socialized with. And so you can see like there's a lot of concentration around this node and more concentration around this node. So this is another form of graph. And in general, there's a lot of graph data everywhere, and there's in many sizes. So to give you a flavor of this is this karate graph. It only has 34 nodes and 78 edges. While we can find a very small molecule data set, QM9, it's like a very famous, it's like the punching bag of machine learning for molecules. There's 134 individual graphs, but the graphs are kind of small. There's only at most 9 edges, 9 nodes. Well, we can look at, for example, the knowledge graph of Wikipedia English of all the links of different concepts. You can have 12 million nodes, and there's like 378 million edges. So it's like highly connected. And it's like, so when you see this range of data, you can think about like, okay, how can I put this in an algorithm? How can I put this in a machine? How can I be efficient when I'm processing this information? Something also you can see is that, for example, one of the nodes is highly connected, has 1 million connections. I don't know what that is. It's probably like I don't know, like this, like the word this, like connected everywhere. So it's just, the data can vary a lot. And so how do we design algorithms that work in all these different data domains? So this is where we get into graph problems and how can we solve them with graph neural network. So let me tell you about what we would maybe call a global task. So this is trying to solve a question about the global system. So the question is, we have individual graphs, we have 4 graphs, and the question might be, which of these graphs contains 2 rings? So that's like something that you can visually answer, right? It's like this one, 2 rings, only 1 ring, 1 ring. Because the question is directly on the entire graph, that's why we call it the global task. We can also have node tasks. So node task is where the question is centered on the actual individual node. So we have the entire graph, and thinking about this problem with a karate club, there the problem is, can we predict who's going to be allied to Mr. He or John A, to the administrator or the karate instructor? And so there we're trying to predict, is it one or the other? And the other task you could think about is edge task. So for example, we can get this karate image. You could do image segmentation to pick out the relevant actors. So you got like Johnny, Daniel, the referee, and maybe the mat. And maybe what you care about is how do each of these components interact with each other? And so the question is like, we know they're connected, but what is the nature of the connection? So we can have a connection that says fighting, watching, standing on. So there you're trying to predict 3 things. Like what's it? And so the question is like, can we answer what the edge is? So this is just one example. There's many graph types of problems, but this is just to show you that you can cast a lot of these problems under this framework of just thinking about graphs and the individual components. So the prompt, the next prompt, how can we convert a graph into a number? And this is useful because we're going to try to solve problems with algorithms, like how do we convert any graph into a number or a collection of numbers? So, you know, one thing to think about is like, I'm going to give you a graph. How would you get numbers on this graph? So, okay, talk to another random neighbor. Going back, how do we convert the graph into a number? Anybody have a quick response? Adjacency matrix?
So, yeah, adjacency matrices, then potentially maybe dimensionality reduction.
Yeah, that would be one way of converting a number. Something else? Yeah.
Just count the number of vertices minus the number of edges and subtract 2 for no apparent reason.
Yeah, I like that. It's, you know, it's like a very handcrafted, domain-specific way of creating a number, right? Yeah, count the number of nodes, count the number of edges. Every graph has that. Every graph has adjacency matrix, and you can apply it through whatever pipeline you want. Any other response? So let's go over one example. So here we have a very simple graph. You know, and we can do a lot of the things that people just said right now. We can calculate the number of nodes. We can calculate the number of edges. We can calculate the number of red nodes, number of teal nodes. We can calculate statistics on the neighborhood, average number of edges per node. We can also look at the maximum number of edges, minimum number of edges. In general, you can see that it's all about calculating statistics on different aspects of connectivity or the nodes or the edges. So already with this, you can already, you know, somebody gives you a graph, you can convert it into a collection of numbers, and you can put that in whatever predictive algorithm you want. So this is already like and for some problem domains, this is already like a really good technique. You can do like invent 1,000 formulas that are handcrafted and will give you like a large vector. You can put that through a random forest, and that's gonna be really good, like 80% of the time. A different way that we can also do this is neural networks. And I think one useful way of thinking about a neural network is as a transformation that takes in a vector and it gives you out a new vector. So it's like vector in, vector out. And the key component of a neural network is that it's parameterized, optimizable, and it's a transformation. So what that means is there's numbers that we can tune and we can optimize. So we can concatenate these transformations so that you can sort of progressively learn a transformation that converts one vector into another vector. But we're dealing with graphs, so how do we adjust something that converts only vectors into other vectors? And one of the key difficulties that I think somebody sort of pointed out before is that we have this connectivity object, which is the adjacency matrix. And one of the problems is that based on the ordering of how we order nodes, we can have very different matrices that represent the same object. And in particular, this is a combinatorically hard problem. Turns out that if you consider all the different types of combinations, you have n factorial number of possible graphs. So adjacency matrices are in itself not a very efficient form of data, because you could say, like, if you want to do data augmentation, like you can't generate all graphs. There's like too many possibilities. So part of the idea is like, how do we incorporate this this problem into our model so that we can sort of learn and get around this like problem of ordering the nodes. A graph doesn't care about how you order the nodes. You can come up with an ordering, but it's the same graph if you order it differently. And this is particularly salient because it's a matrix that is number of nodes by number of nodes. If you look at this big knowledge graph, it's like, you're not going to build that matrix. You can't have that in a computer right now. Maybe it's like, maybe in a supercomputer, but you can't do like, you know, it's 12 million times 12 million, huge. So one way that we can represent this connectivity object is with what is called an adjacency list. And this is because the adjacency matrix tends to be very sparse. So the number of connections is actually much lower than the things that are not connected. So you can come up with an ordering. Here we're ordering the nodes, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you just keep a collection of what is connected to what. 1 is connected to 0, 2 is connected to 0, 4 is connected to 3, 6 is connected to 2. We're going to be able to use this adjacency list later on for an operation that allows us to look at like local neighborhoods inside of our graph. So let me give you a very simple example of a graph neural network. A very simple example of a graph neural network is something that takes a graph as input and it gives you another graph. So instead of vector in, vector out, it's graph in, graph out. And what we're learning is a transformation of our graph into a new graph. We loaded up our graph with vector information, and we're going to learn new vectors. So it's going to be the same graph, just different vectors. So a very easy way of setting this up is for every attribute, for the nodes, these are the nodes. For the connections and for the global information, we can just put a multi-layer perceptron on it. Or your favorite vector in, vector out transformation. And so this is already going to learn a representation. This is already a graph neural network. It's not going to be a very good graph neural network, but it's a graph neural network by definition. And so we can already solve problems with this graph neural network. If our question is centered on nodes, we can just pick out the information from our nodes and pass it through like a classification layer or your favorite predictive model and ask the question that you're asking. Is it a red or is it teal? It's also it's much harder when you start to think about how do I change something that's like an edge to a node or a global to a node when you're passing information from one attribute of the graph to another attribute of the graph. So if we want to pass information, for example, from an edge to ask a question about nodes, what we can do is, for example, we can introduce an operation called pooling. Pooling will look at neighboring information. You can think about it as a little bit like rerouting information. So if I look at an edge, every edge is connected to 2 nodes. So we can use every edge. So one way of looking at this is like we can center ourselves on the edge. And for every edge, we produce 2 vectors or 2 results that is for each of the nodes. And that's already a prediction. You can plug this in. Here's a more detailed example. We have a particular node right here. We have a particular node, and you can see that this node is only connected to 2 edges. So we're going to collect information from the 2 edges, and we are going to use an operation that is called aggregation. This is anything that converts a variable number of things into another number. So sum, mean, max, mean, variance are very common aggregation operations. So this allows us to convert 2, 3, sometimes it can be 5. This is a highly connected node. We collect 5 edges, and it allows us to like sum them up into new. Yes.
In the previous slide, when you're going from edges to nodes, you're also doing an aggregation on the nodes?
Yeah. The pooling operation, another way of using a pooling operation is an aggregation operation. Yeah, it's this operation where you look at neighboring information and you reroute it to wherever you care to reroute it to. It's gonna make more sense once we like look at all the different ways that you can create these connections. So this is one example of aggregation. This is aggregation in a different node. We can also ask the question, what if we want to ask a question that goes from nodes to edges? So for example, for every edge, you can look at all the neighboring nodes and pull information from there. So the trick is anytime you want to jump information from one part of the graph to another part of the graph, you just have to design how do you pull information around neighboring information. And so the pipeline looks like we have a graph. We have our graph neural network layers or blocks that are learning new graphs. We get a new graph, and then we plug in our predictive model into whatever part of the graph we care about. asking a question. And so if we're asking multiple questions, you just plug in multiple types of predictive model. So, one of the main things is that, like, if you just look at this, we're just transforming information from, global to global, node to node, edge to edge. We're not taking into account so much the how things are connected. And so that's the main part. Once you add this information of connectivity, you get like a much more expressive graph neural network. And so this is where we go inside of a graph neural network. And so here we have a GIF of what a single message passing looks like. Message passing is sort of this concept of that's inside of a graph neural network. When you think about graph neural networks, message passing neural networks, there's many different ways of looking at them. And so this is what one step of message passing looks like. The first step is, for every node, we get all the neighboring nodes that are based on the connectivity. And so this is where we use the adjacency list because it tells us how information is routed. We collect all the vectors that are located in that information. And we use an aggregation operation that gives us a new vector. And then we know how to do this, right? Vector in, vector out. And we use this new vector to load it into the node that we were looking at. So there's three main steps: aggregate, transform, and update. And like these algorithms are flexible. You can actually you could first say I'm going to transform the information and then aggregate it. The important thing is that this aggregation operation, it doesn't matter the order in which you give things. So this is where you actually don't care about the ordering. You can decide on ordering, but because summing up things is invariant to the number of things that you have or the ordering of the things, it's always the same thing. So your algorithm is baked into be what is called permutation invariant. And so this is the main. Here's the main nugget that you want to get when you're thinking about graph neural networks. And one of the reasons graph neural networks are efficient is because when we put these into layers, here we can start with a single node, and we can see that it already pulls information from neighboring things at radius 1, radius 2, and radius 3. So your node gets to look at everything in an iterative fashion, and you get to learn things at one neighborhood, farther away neighborhood, and more farther away neighborhood. So the information gets propagated. One limitation you can see from this is that for doing 3 layers, you're only looking at things at a distance of 3. So there's many ways of thinking about how to improve these things and how to create tricks so you can see farther or reroute information. And sort of the type of diagram you might see is sort of, you have sources of information. And for example, this new pooling operation is you look at everything at a distance 1. A more complex and really good diagram that I like is the GraphNets architecture, in part because they look at different ways of rerouting information. So they reroute information from global information from the nodes into the edges. And then they also they're going to pull information from the global information to the edges to the nodes. So you're pulling information from all the different spots. And so your nodes get to look at the edges. They get to look at the global information. Your edges get to look at the global information. They get to look at the nodes. So it's a way of just passing information to all the different objects. And there's many things you can study with these things. How do we incorporate more context? How do we combine all these sources of information? For example, for this particular node, we have all the information about the adjacent nodes, adjacent edges, and we also have the system information, the global information. So how do we condition our node or information based on all this other information? That's the whole art. It's there's a lot of research on that. And if you go into the Distill blog post, there's a lot of layers that there's an interactive graph neural network. So you can actually play around with all the decisions you would make inside of a graph neural network and see what their effect is when you're doing a very simple task. You're predicting if something is pungent or not. If a small molecule is pungent. Sounds like a weird thing, but that's actually area of research. How do you predict what is something going to smell like? And one of the main things, I think, and this is where we're closing up, is Graph-neural networks are very parameter efficient. Here we have on the x-axis the number of parameters, and on the y-axis, a performance metrics, AUC, for predicting does something small pungent or not. You can see that often graph-neural networks are really good because they don't need that much information. Or they don't need that many parameters. And so one of the reasons why you might want to use a graph-neural network versus other algorithms is because we're baking in what we know about graphs. You get much better performance either in compute or either in training time, or just like, you get like much more controlled predictions. And one of the other takeaways is that if you want to improve your graph-neural network, don't think too much about like, oh, am I using ReLU, GALU, all these things. What's more important is build your graph. If you build better graphs, you're going to get better models. Like often you're going to find that really what decides things, here we look at different ways of rerouting information. The best models tend to be things that reroute all types of information. So try to exploit those relationships that exist. Try to like utilize them. The more information gets communicated, the better you're going to be able to solve the problem. And yeah, so we're going to close it to just this prompt, and then we can like open up for other discussion. Besides predictions, what are other operations you would like to perform on graphs?
Before we go into this, just one quick question. When you say build a better graph, can you give any pointers? What's a bad graph? What's a bad way to build a graph? Maybe that's easier to answer.
Yeah, so how do you build a better graph? One example is thinking about different levels of hierarchy in the graph. So I work with molecules. Here you could think about a little molecule. You have your little atoms and little bonds. In chemistry, we have this concept of functional groups, which is collections, like very common collections of subgraphs. So this could be this ring is a subgroup. This is another subgroup and another subgroup. So you could imagine creating another graph that is related on these like bigger subgraph concepts. So this is one common word you're going to find is hypernodes, like a bigger node. And you can connect in the same way, like these atoms into this other group. And these groups now can share information. And so in this case, we're building a graph that has multiple layers. Another very easy way of building a better graph, load in more information in the graph. Like if you have more statistics, like whatever like empirical formula that you come up with, like put that in. Like the more prior information you put into your graph, the better. If you can think about different ways of connecting things, you can create multiple connections. This is the same graph, but we're actually creating like blue connections, red connections, and green connections. So you can have, and when we get into these type of graphs, this is normally where you're going to find it in literature as heterogeneous graphs. It's heterogeneous because there's different types of nodes and different types of edges. A normal graph, the one that I showed you before, you only have one type of node and one type of edge. And here you're saying, actually, there's many types of interconnecting and interacting objects. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Are there any drawbacks to just adding more, okay, not random information, deliberate information, but could we blow up in terms of complexity? Could the computation suffer from just adding more and more?
Yeah, I think that always the problem when you go for more richer graphs is there's two problems. One is an engineering problem. Like when you have to wrangle data that's so complex, like you really have to be able to think about it very clearly because you're making all these connections. So like, it's just like, how do you set up these systems? And there are machine learning packages for setting up these systems. There's less packages for heterogeneous graphs. And there's less support for that. And you know, it's also like there's many more decisions. So you can get decision paralysis. How do I update these type of connections? How do I update these type of connections? How do I model these different types of connections? The decision space expands very fast, right? Because there's so many more interacting components.
Do you have to design different aggregation for different edge types between?
Yeah, there's, and actually, how do you pick out aggregation operations is like a field of research. I would say, and there's more details in the blog post. I would say, like, don't worry about aggregation operations at all. Just pick some. Or if you want to pick the state of the art, use what is called principal neighborhood aggregation, which is just all of them and concatenated. And that works really well. Like actually, you know, I showed that there was a lot of decisions. I would say the most important things is how do you pass information and how do you optimize it? Like, don't worry too much about the rest. Just focus on these components. Often you're going to find really good graph neural networks, irrespective of how many, the dimensionality of your layers, your layer norm, etc. Oh, and use layer normalization. Don't use batch norm. I mean, at least that's my experience. There's another question.
I'm curious to hear more about how you choose the right hypernodes. I'm sure there are like certain tests. I mean, in the example you gave with molecules, it's kind of, you've chosen a benzene ring. Like we know that that's a hypernode, but in context where you might not know what the hypernode should be, what algorithmically would you do to assess what is most effective? Yeah, I mean, so here it helps a lot that there's domain knowledge. And actually Wengong has like very relevant work on like this idea of like multi-layers with a junction tree. There's many algorithms, and actually like many algorithms have come out in the last few years about how do you actually like pick out these extra hypernodes. I would say like pick a simple heuristic first, like just like you know there's algorithms, even non-ML algorithms for mining sort of community detection algorithms that will find relevant subgraphs. Like you can start with that as a starting point. One like brute force way of doing it is you create the nodes and you just connect them to everything, and you kind of force your model to decide to pick how it's connected. But you know, there you get into the problem, like, you know, you need to investigate what the connections are being made. And you're also connecting everything, which makes it less efficient, right?
Could you maybe leverage some kind of prior data and trained models, you know, for some related prediction tasks, and kind of look under the hood with some type of interpretability method to maybe use that as a way to define hypernodes?
Yeah, that's actually like, there's a paper called GNN Explainer. Here, you know, so what you could do is you could extract the most relevant subgraph and use that as a basis. You can use attribution over the nodes and pick out things. There's many techniques now for doing these things. So, you know, it's kind of like you just got to try things out and see what works. I wonder if Wengong has like any thoughts on that matter.
I remember there's a paper from Stanford that also they learn how to, not necessarily on interpretability, but like how to learn to like coarsen the graph kind of progressively by kind of learning basically the model decides how to create hypernodes. I think that's sort of one related to that hierarchical graph construction. So that's maybe answers like Ashley's question a little bit. Yeah, for the interpretability part, I think what's most interesting is can you actually find a subgraph that kind of explains like in the case of molecules, maybe some part of the graph that contributes most to the activity of the molecule, like when they bind to a protein, maybe that's the part that actually goes in deep into the pocket. That could be sort of the explanation. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is like, what an explanation means is very context dependent. So sometimes this idea of just extracting a subgraph is not useful, in the sense of, for example, with molecules, you can have multiple subgraphs and they're interacting. Maybe you care about the distance that you can find them. So, you know, it's like you have to like figure out how people are talking about these things to like create that solution. There's another question.
Yep, one more practical question, I guess. So for those who are coming from other sort of domains, for example, working with images, you know, there are these things now that you pick your favorite deep learning framework like Torch, and there's Torch Vision, and then pre-trained models and all that kind of stuff. And then you just take it off the shelf, feed it images in it, and get your embeddings with our classifier fine-tuned. Is there a such thing? Because it feels like there are so many different types of graph. You can work with molecules, but you can also work with like meshes representing shapes of objects in 3D, right? Is there libraries or like pre-trained models if you want to just try it out off the shelf?
Yeah, there's a lot of libraries. So I think the most popular one is probably PyTorch, Geometric, and DGL. I personally kind of like DGL a little bit more, just because I like when things are put in a very message passing framework. Almost all algorithms fit into that framework. There's TensorFlow graph neural network. I think that's a good choice if you want a production model. So you want a model that you can send to somebody and they can replicate it. And if you want heterogeneous graph support, in JAX, there's JRAF. I particularly work a lot with GraphNets. It's the DeepMind graph neural network library. I like it a lot because if you look at the code, there's like at most 600 lines. So if you can understand those 600 lines, like you already know how to work with everything. So, everything is sort of exposed. There's a single algorithm most of the times. You don't have to think about, oh, should I use Sage? Should I use there's like, I don't know, 50 layers. What's your experience going on?
I think the PyTorch geometric, if you want something that's black box, then you can try PyTorch geometric. I kind of tend to like implement my own because I can play with it.
Any other questions? We're already almost in discussion mode, right?
Yes, with that, I think let's thank Benjamin. Any more questions, please feel free to come up to the front. Thank you.
Oh, let's go over this good question. Would you say it's this one? Is there a minimum size of graph neural networks are relevant? I think probably empirically for myself, when working with molecules, I found that when you have at least 500 molecules at least, but I think 1,000 or 2,000, graph neural networks tend to be a good choice. If it's less than that, I would use a random forest or Gaussian process, just because it's like so much faster to spin up. So I think it's useful to think about in terms of number of nodes. So for example, a small molecule has probably 20 nodes. And if I have 1,000 graphs, that means you have 20,000 nodes. So if you're learning on nodes, you have sort of 20,000 examples in a way, right? In a hand wavy way. So when you're looking about when should I use a graph neural network, think about how much information you have. If you have like 20,000 nodes, that kind of seems like you're, okay, that sounds like I could use deep learning for it at some moment, right? MNIST is 40,000, 50,000 examples for a training set. So, I think that's like a good metric. I don't know, do you have a heuristic, Wengang? Like when should you use a graph neural network? When should you not use it? Like how big of a graph data set?
I honestly don't know. That this is an empirical question that kind of start to like really become like data set specific, right? So for molecules, what I tend to see is like if you get have a 500 data set, 500 data points in a data set, sometimes other like fixed features like Morgan fingerprint will do as well. So Morgan fingerprint is just a way of hashing the graph into a fixed length vector so that you can just use like feed-forward neural networks. But it really depends. It's a case by case. So
yeah. I think just like any neural network machine learning problem, like you should figure out the baselines first. And like that baseline is already going to give you a sense of like, should I invest more time and effort in this or not? Because often a baseline might work really well, right? So like figure out what your baseline is first. That might guide you if you should use a graph neural network or not.